The purpose of this video is to make the case for imperfect competition as being better for consumers than perfect competition. And in this video, we'll really dive into the economics and the science of why that is. Perfect competition is what you get when the following four assumptions are true. 1. There are many buyers and sellers of a good. 2. Barriers to entry into the market are low or non-existent. 3. The goods sold by different firms are essentially identical. And 4. Consumers have full information about prices and quantity of goods being sold. If you watched the video on Populist Conservatism number 4, then you already know that a world of perfect competition is very stagnant. But what may not be clear is why the dynamic world of imperfect competition actually works. Why do competitive forces drive down prices even if firms have monopoly power? And that's what this video is going to be about. Let's start by looking at the case when the first assumption of perfect competition is not true, when there's only one firm selling a good, so a monopoly. Now that happens anytime a firm invents a new product. So when Apple invented the first touchscreen smartphone, they had a monopoly over smartphones. So right off the bat, you should be thinking that monopolies aren't necessarily bad, or else you just live in a world where no one ever invents new things ever again. And if you've watched the other economics videos in this Populist Conservatism series, you already know what happens. One firm invents a new product, they get windfall profits, but other firms want a share of those windfall profits, so they copy the idea and compete with them. And that's exactly what happened with touchscreen smartphones. Windows and Apple both started making touchscreen smartphones, as did BlackBerry for a while. And Windows and BlackBerry never made it, but Android smartphones actually have a larger market share than Apple smartphones now. So there's nothing wrong with monopolies by themselves. Monopolies are actually a very good thing. We want firms to innovate and create new products. The danger with monopolies is when firms have them in a durable and long-standing way that protects them from competition. And that's where the second requirement of perfect competition comes into play, that there are barriers of entry into the market. Because if there are barriers to entry, then other firms can't come in and compete with them very easily. So how do firms get a barrier to entry? One of the most important ways is through economies of scale. Bigger is better. A cook can grill 2 hamburgers with about the same amount of effort as it takes to grill 1. A truck can haul 2 TV sets as easily as it can carry 1. Assembly lines are a great way to create economies of scale. The good thing about economies of scale is they let firms build things quickly and cheaply. That's the whole essence of the parable of the pin makers. If you're not familiar with the parable of the pin makers, it is probably the single most famous parable in all of economics. On page 1 of chapter 1 of Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, which really launched modern economics as a discipline, he describes how a pin maker could only make about 20 pins per day by hand. But with the use of some specialized machinery and assembly line techniques, breaking the job down into steps and having one worker do each step, then the output per worker rose to about 5,000 pins per day. That's the division of labor at work. But the division of labor also creates economies of scale. The bad thing about them is they create barriers to entry. And again, suppose you wanted to enter the pin market before assembly lines came along, and all you needed was a few hand tools and a little bit of wire and you were good to go. But after assembly lines came along, you would need to be able to hire a 20-person shift of workers, you'd need to be able to buy all the machines that were needed in creating the wire for the pins, and finally you'd need to buy a factory or an industrial space so that you'd have a place for the workers and machinery to actually do their jobs. So the barriers to entry got a lot higher after assembly lines. If the economies of scale continue indefinitely until there's only one firm left, then you get what is called a natural monopoly. And a very intuitive example of a natural monopoly is a bridge. If you think about it, it makes sense that it's cheaper to build one big bridge than it is to build 2 small bridges. And that creates a problem. If you've just got one bridge, then the person who owns that bridge can raise his price and gouge the traffic of everyone who wants to cross the river. Alternately, you could have 2 bridges, but now the costs of 2 bridges have to be passed on to consumers. So no matter which route you go, consumers are worse off. With one bridge they get gouged, with 2 bridges they have the price of each bridge passed on to consumers. And that's why for a long time the standard economic theory was that monopolies were bad And the way to fix them is you have the government grant one firm a monopoly. That way you don't have a second firm enter and pass on the cost of making a new bridge to consumers. So you save that there. But then you get the problem of the one firm. And so in exchange for being granted monopoly status, that one firm has its prices regulated by the government so that they're kept low and fair. However, there are two main problems with this theory of monopolies. The first problem is that the government is not a neutral, disinterested party when it comes to regulating monopoly firms. The economist Jim Cox gives a good example in his book, The Concise Guide to Economics. He discusses the airline industries, and he writes, "Airlines were regulated beginning in 1938, and in the 40-year period from then until 1978, which is when airlines were deregulated, no new trunk airlines were granted a charter. These 4 decades saw a huge change in the airline business as the airplane technology advanced from propellers to jets, from 20-seaters to 400-seaters, from speeds of 120 miles an hour to speeds of 600 miles per hour. Yet the Civil Aeronautics Board found no need to allow new competitors in the growing industry. This fact alone makes it quite clear that the purpose of the regulation was not to protect the consumer, but to protect the market of the established airlines." Think about it this way. The airline manufacturers were doing their job. They were building much, much better airplanes. But the airlines themselves were not. They were taking advantage of their regulated state in order to keep out competitors so that they didn't have to innovate or drop prices the way that Standard Oil did. And it was only after 1978 that airlines like Southwest could actually make interstate flights. Prior to 1978, Southwest was confined to flying routes within the state of Texas only, and they couldn't spread their innovative new methods into a national airline until after airlines were deregulated. The second problem with the old theory of creating a monopoly firm by government fiat and then regulating it is that firms are actually quite innovative, and the cost of building a second bridge is quite trivial in the long run. So compare airlines to cell phone service. Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile each have their own network of cell phone towers, which means that the cost of 3 rival cell phone networks has to be passed on to consumers. Yet cell service has gotten massively cheaper over time. And I can remember when I was much younger and started dating my wife when we were just a dating couple, and we were in constant fear of going over our minutes. And if you went over your minutes back in those days, like, that was it. That was game over. You might as well just sign your firstborn child over to the cell phone companies. And yet, fast forward just 20 years into the future, and every phone company gives unlimited talk and text as table stakes. So you no longer have to worry about going over your voice. They don't even bother to meter that anymore. And even data has gotten to where it's essentially unmetered. I think modern cell phone contracts have a threshold in there somewhere, and if you go over the threshold, they start throttling you. But they don't charge you extra money like they used to, and I don't even notice when I'm over the limit, so I forget to put my own phone on Wi-Fi a lot and never even notice. So compare cell phone companies to airlines, and you see why the old theory of declaring one firm an official government monopoly and then regulating it is generally a terrible idea. There's another very important economic principle that works against monopolies. And if you think back to the requirements of perfect competition, one of them is that the different firms make essentially identical goods. And that's true if you want to buy a commodity like hard red winter wheat number 2, but it's not true for most goods. The French fries at McDonald's are different from the fries made by Five Guys, and the burger made by Five Guys is very different than the burger made by In-N-Out Burger or Shake Shack. And a Honda Accord is different than a Toyota Camry, and both are different from a Corvette or a Tesla. Some pizza places will specialize in deep dish or brick oven or New York style. So in the real world, firms don't just compete on price, they also compete on features. And competition based on features is called monopolistic competition. Economists used to criticize monopolistic competition, and that's probably why it has such a scary sounding name. They used to feel that it led to an inefficient duplication of services. So think about all those fast food restaurants across the street from each other. Once you add in the advertising costs for all these different fast food restaurants, and the result is higher prices that have to get passed on to consumers. So they used to think we should just have one fast food restaurant, and then they won't have to advertise because they're the only game in town. But modern economists realize that consumers are willing to pay a premium in order to have a variety of choices. No one wants to live in a world with just one type of French fry, or just one type of car, or just one type of pizza. The trade-off is that when a firm has a winning formula, like McDonald's with their French fries, then they can make a profit. And once again, this profit is called either market power or monopoly power. And it doesn't mean that they have the power of a government-granted monopoly, it just means they have some degree of ability to set prices. So, now that you understand monopolistic competition, here's how it works against monopolies. Think about how a bridge is a textbook example of a natural monopoly. And it's true that a single bridge can supply the entire market with the service of crossing the river. But no one wants to drive to the bridge in North Jamesport if they're in South Jamesport. So just like consumers are willing to pay a premium to have different kinds of fast food, they are also willing to pay a premium for the convenience of having multiple bridges. Similarly, let's go back to Adam Smith's example of the pin makers. Even if that market were a natural monopoly, which means that one firm could supply the entire market more cheaply than having 2 or 3 firms, the fact is that consumers still want some variety. So some consumers may want larger pins, or smaller pins, or skinnier pins, or pins with a sharper point, or pins made out of a stronger metal, or less expensive pins made out of a weaker metal, or pins made out of plastic. So monopolistic competition benefits consumers by giving them choice, but those choices also mean that one firm can't gain monopoly power. And you see that quite often in real-world markets. If you're old enough to remember the days before Apple got glamorous, Microsoft really dominated the computer market with, say, 90% of the market share or so. But there was still that 5 or 10% that liked Apple just because they were in desktop publishing or education where Apple was strong. So just having one small firm with a different product can be a very valuable check on monopoly power, and these days Apple has a significantly higher market share than they once did. Monopolistic competition also has its own checks, which is that firms copy each other. So Chick-fil-A was very successful for their crispy chicken sandwich, but McDonald's and Popeyes each created their own knockoffs of it. And Coca-Cola started distributing Dasani bottled water when bottled water started becoming popular. And then think about the iPhone with its touchscreen interface. That led to Android phones copying Amazon, and now virtually the entire ecology of the smartphone market has touchscreen phones. However, monopolistic competition does have one very important downside, which is that it is a vector for racism to be economically rational. If you think back to the last video on the case for free markets, I argued that free markets work against racism using rent control. So without rent control, apartments may stay vacant for quite a while until you can find a qualified applicant. So a racist white landlord isn't going to turn down a qualified black applicant unless his racism is so valuable to him that he'd rather lose thousands of dollars to indulge it, and most racists aren't going to do that. However, monopolistic competition flips that dynamic upside down. The racist landlord could offer the product of apartments with no black people to cater to racist tenants, and that's exactly what the former NBA owner Donald Sterling did. He rented apartments that excluded blacks and Hispanics. Economists call this consumer-driven racism. And this is the kind of racism that can survive in a free market. Because of monopolistic competition, true monopolies are quite rare, and even Standard Oil peaked at about 88% market share. Instead, what you tend to get are oligopolies, which means markets that are dominated by a small number of firms. Soda is dominated by Coke and Pepsi. Computers are dominated by Microsoft, Apple, and Google Chromebooks. Cellular services are dominated by Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile. So, even though most real-world firms are not existing in a perfectly competitive market, profit shares are nevertheless quite low. So in 2023, Walmart had a profit margin of about 2.5%. ExxonMobil, as an oil company, has a little bit more market power, but their profits were only 11.5%. And if you check a source like the Concise Encyclopedia of Economics, then you'll see that the typical firm in the United States has a profits of about 4% to 7%, depending on the strength of the economy in a particular year. So Microsoft these days is one of the most successful firms in the country, and they have a close to monopoly over personal computing, and yet their profits are only a relatively modest 35%. So the lesson of Standard Oil applies here, which is that firms just do not have much ability to gouge consumers, even in an oligopoly market. And so that raises the question, why are profit margins so low in oligopoly markets? To answer that question, we turn to the second most famous economist with the last name of Smith. So we saw Adam Smith at the start of this video, now we're turning to Vernon Smith. And he had the seemingly crazy idea of actually putting economic principles to experimental testing. And the way he did this was by creating simulated markets with real human beings in the laboratory. And in this process, he created the field of experimental economics, and he received the Nobel Prize for this in 2002. In a classic experiment, he took college students and assigned them to the roles of buyers and sellers in a market based on the New York Stock Exchange. So some students might be told, you have 10 pork bellies and you need to sell them, and other students might be told, you need to buy 25 pork bellies. The students described this market as unorganized, unstable, chaotic, and confused. And if you've seen footage of the New York Stock Exchange, you can understand why. But it worked. The students converged on a going price for the pork bellies, and Vernon Smith had actually put his prediction of the price in a sealed envelope and opened it, and the students were amazed to find out that he had correctly predicted the price. But it wasn't magic. What he had done was he had just used standard economics 101 reasoning based on perfect competition to predict what the price would be given the quantities being bought and sold. And the students converged on this price even though they did not have perfect competition. And that's the main lesson of experimental economics, which is that you don't need hundreds of buyers and sellers to come up with a price that approximates perfect competition. So Don Corsi summarizes the research and finds that most markets reach competitive outcomes as long as there are about 4 firms in competition. And even a single competitor makes a big difference. Ruben Kessel found that in bond markets, adding a second firm to the bidding cut profits in half. Now, in theory, oligopoly firms should collude and charge the exact same price as a monopoly firm. But in practice, this is very difficult because each firm has an incentive to backslide in order to undercut their rivals and increase their market share. And earlier I criticized the Sherman Antitrust Act, but this is one part of the Sherman Antitrust Act that is good. It makes colluding illegal. If that weren't true, then you could have, say, all the car dealers enter into a legal agreement to gouge consumers, and they could set their prices in a legal agreement, and they could even take each other to court or to arbitration if someone started backsliding. But with the Sherman Antitrust Act, that's illegal, so if they're going to collude, they have to do it implicitly, and that makes it extremely unstable. And another problem that works against this is our old friend, monopolistic competition. So if one firm specializes in sedans and another firm specializes in sport utility vehicles, then they're going to have to agree on how the market changes in order to implicitly collude. Because suppose gas prices go down, that's going to help the firm that sells SUVs, but the firm that sells sedans may not want to yield market shares to SUVs in this time. So monopolistic competition also makes it harder to implicitly collude. So at this point, I feel like I've dealt with most of the scary economic stuff that people tend to throw out, like monopolies and Standard Oil and oligopolies, but there is still one type of monopoly that's even more stubborn than all of these, and this is the network monopoly. And the main insight of a network monopoly is there are some things that are better if you can do them with other people. So it's more fun to play sports with other people than by yourself. There's no point being the only person in the world with a cell phone if you've got no one to call or text. So goods that are better to do with other people are called network goods. And the thing about network goods is they get better and better the larger your network gets. So having one big network is better than having 2 small networks. And so this creates a particularly stubborn type of monopoly. These network effects explain a lot of seemingly random things, like why are acting jobs clustered in Hollywood and programming jobs clustered in Silicon Valley and financial jobs clustered in New York City. And this is network effects. So if you want to start a tech firm, you have to go where all the programmers are. And if you want a job in tech, you have to go to where all the tech firms are. So once one place like Silicon Valley gets a reputation as being a focal point, everybody moves there to participate in that network. I remember when I first moved to Silicon Valley in the 1990s and driving by firms like EMC and Cisco, and seeing the actual headquarters of these firms felt almost like someone showing me the houses of famous movie stars in California. So the key thing about network monopolies is that they are good. We want to enjoy the benefit of participating in a large network. But the problem with a large network is it can lead to a new type of market failure called lock-in. And that's what happens when consumers get locked into an inferior product. One of the classic examples of lock-in that really dominates the economics literature is the war between VHS and Betamax. And for younger viewers, VHS and Betamax were basically like the Sony versus Xbox of how to watch movies back in the 1980s. And according to popular mythology, the wrong format won. VHS beat out the superior Betamax because consumers were already locked into VHS. So consumers wouldn't buy Betamax players because the video stores only rented VHS tapes. And similarly, video stores would only buy VHS tapes because no consumers had Betamax players. Now, this was held up for literally decades as a textbook example of a network monopoly creating lock-in, and yet the passage of time shows that it's just absurd and comical. The market had no trouble switching from VHS to DVD, from DVD to Blu-ray, and then from Blu-ray to streaming services like Apple and Amazon. So the idea that we somehow get locked in just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but let's take a deeper look anyways. In reality, Betamax and VHS had very comparable technology. The main difference is that Betamax tapes were smaller but could only record 1 hour of programming. VHS tapes were larger but could record 2 hours, so you could put a full-length movie on them. The only real advantage of Betamax was that it had a special form of tape threading that made it more suited for editing and adding special effects. But most consumers didn't care about that, they just wanted to record and watch movies. So the VHS format was actually superior. Now Sony, which created Betamax, knew that they were in trouble and they quickly doubled the recording time to 2 hours, but then VHS doubled theirs to 4 hours, so you could put a football game or a baseball game on it. And Betamax ultimately increased their recording time to 5 hours and VHS to 8 hours. But because VHS originally chose to make a larger tape, they could always offer a better image quality with the same amount of recording time due to that larger tape size. Those trade-offs are just better on VHS. Sony gambled that people wanted small portable tapes, and that gamble was simply wrong. And in another classic twist on the lock-in theory, Betamax actually came out first. It was released a year or two before VHS. So the story is literally the opposite of the myth. The superior VHS took on the inferior Betamax and won. The other classic example of lock-in is the arrangement of keys on a keyboard. Standard keyboards are called QWERTY after the arrangements of the letters on the top row. Q, W, E, R, T, Y are the first letters on the top row going from left to right. And it was designed back in the days of manual typewriters that were prone to jamming, so it slowed down typists and prevented jams. However, as typewriters became more sophisticated and the technology improved, they also became less likely to jam. And in 1936, August Dvorak patented the Dvorak simplified keyboards. It moved all the commonly used letters to the middle row of the keyboard and put the vowels under the left hand to encourage load balancing between right and left hands. So this reduced finger travel and increased typing speeds. Yet, despite its merits, the Dvorak keyboard never caught on because we were all locked into the inferior QWERTY. Now, Dvorak keyboards do minimize finger travel, and they do a better job of load balancing between two hands. But there is one area where QWERTY is better. It does a better job of alternating hands than Dvorak. And that's the real secret of why QWERTY prevented jams. If you're old enough to have used a manual typewriter, then you know the best way to get a jam is to hit two keys that are close together at the same time. So QWERTY, by being designed to alternate your hands, made jams less likely. And alternating hands is fast. So, although Dvorak is definitely faster than QWERTY, it's not that much faster. There's a lot of old ergonomics research literature but the economists Dan Leibovitz and Stephen Margolis review the modern ergonomics literature, and they find that Dvorak is only about 2 to 6% faster. Still, the Dvorak keyboard is faster, so does this mean that this is a case of network lock-in and market failure? The answer is no. And the reason is that you have to factor in the cost of switching. So forget about network monopolies and lock-in for just a second. The fact of the matter is, firms and people have to make decisions constantly, and with the benefit of hindsight, we sometimes wish we made different choices. But that's not a market failure because we made the wrong choice. So maybe Subaru wishes they made their Outback 4 inches longer, or maybe a toy company wished they built a factory in Indonesia instead of Taiwan, or maybe the owner of a local pizza place wished he rented in that fast-growing downtown warehouse district instead of the downtown era. So hindsight's 20/20. The fact that you didn't figure it out perfectly is not a market failure. It's only a market failure if the cost of making the change is smaller than the benefits, and yet you can't make the change because you're locked in. And the story of QWERTY versus Dvorak has a modern twist, which is that these days there are a plethora of newer and better keyboard arrangements such as Colmac and Maltron, and in fact you can even do a software analysis and create your own keyboard arrangement based on the words you tend to use in your own writing. And let's also keep in mind that the court stenographers would point out that stenography is way faster than all of these keyboards. The takeaway from all this is we are not locked into QWERTY, but if you are in a field where faster typing speed makes sense, like working as a court stenographer, then it makes sense to learn some other type of keyboard arrangement. The real lesson of network monopolies is not lock-in, but serial monopolies. So Betamax was conquered by VHS. VHS was conquered by DVD. DVD was conquered by Blu-ray. Blu-ray was conquered by Apple and Amazon streaming. So one product is released and established as a network monopoly, but then it gets conquered by a superior product. That's the real story. But then that raises a question. How exactly does that happen? The benefits of having a network seem so compelling. And there's two main ways that this does happen. The first is backwards compatibility. So for example, Blu-ray players made it a point to be backwards compatible with DVD. So that eased the transition. You could continue to watch your old DVDs on your new Blu-ray player. But the most important strategy is monopolistic competition. Once again, consumers like variety. So think about social media. That's a classic network monopoly. And yet, there are a ton of different social media sites out there. There's Facebook, there's Twitter/X, there's Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, TikTok, and probably a lot more. So each social network offers different benefits to different types of users, and people gravitate towards the ones that meet their particular needs. Video games work the same way. There's really 4 main platforms for video games: Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo, and PCs. Each of these platforms has their own strengths and weaknesses. Nintendo's got some great exclusives like Mario and Zelda, and PCs offer the highest performance and the best graphics, but they're a little bit more work, they're not quite as easy to get going, and they're expensive. And then you've got Xbox and PlayStation somewhere in the middle. And I'll give one more example: streaming services. I remember in the old days of cable, people saying, oh, I would save so much money if I only had to pay for the cable channels that I actually liked. And now that's the reality that's here, and we're all paying for, it seems like, 5 different streaming services. So in theory, any one of them could meet the good of something to watch tonight, but in practice, they all have different lineups of different shows, and we end up paying for tons of them. And so what this means is there's enough competition going on that any one of these could take over at any point in time. And what this shows is that if you're supporting a variety of different network goods, that it's very easy for one of the smaller networks to take over its larger, more established rival. So the lesson from all this is that economic conservatives need to shift the way they defend markets. Markets should not be defended on the grounds of perfect competition ruthlessly driving down prices to the cost of manufacturing. Perfect competition is a stagnant world with no technological change, no innovation, and a world where your children are doomed to live the same life that you do. Imperfect competition is a world of innovation and a world where your children will live a better life. But the trade-off of imperfect competition is firms having monopoly power. But if you understand markets in a dynamic way, then the analysis changes. The goal is not ruthless competition that drives profits down to the bone. The goal is innovation. We want to encourage firms to invent new products like touchscreen smartphones, and we want firms to learn how to make existing products for much less money. That's the real goal of free markets, to incentivize that process. And windfall profits are the bait, they're the carrot dangling on the stick in front of the donkey that drives firms to undergo this innovative and competitive process. So to wrap this all up, one of the best quotes about economics and competition comes from the economist George Stigler. He said, "Competition is a hardy weed, not a delicate flower." The next video in this series is one of my favorites. It continues to use economic reasoning, but it uses economic reasoning to make the case for social conservatism. And I'll give you a little teaser of how that works. The social scientist William Galston is a Democrat, and he was an advisor to Bill Clinton during Clinton's presidency, and he identified the three most important social norms to have a flourishing life. They are: 1, graduate from high school; 2, wait until age 20 to get married; and 3, wait until marriage to have children. If you do that, your chances of being poor are only about 8%, and if you don't do those 3 things, your chances of being poor are 92%. So that's the statistic. In the next video, we're going to look at things like hyperbolic time discounting to explain why these norms are so important and why the left has created a whole new class of poverty by their attack on important social norms like this.